I've been dreading this episode, guys. I've actually talked about this topic before, and I'll probably talk about this topic again in my show. I talked about this topic. This is one of the first things I talked about for most people's recollection of my show. Because, yes, what I have to talk about in this episode, and I've been saying this for years, I'm never going to get away from it. It has to do with Mass Effect 3. I'm never going to get away from Mass Effect 3, guys. Though I owe it a great debt. I actually have very few notes about the episode itself. I'll discuss the episode itself in brief. It's a competently presented episode. It's mostly a character piece. It's presented as a day in the life. And I actually rather like it for that. In fact, my biggest complaint about the episode is the parts of the episode that do not have to do with a day in the life. I've talked a few dozen times before about the A-plot, B-plot problem, and in this case, that's the exact same problem we have right here. The A-plot of the episode, the ship is in danger because there's some phenomenon thing, is pointless and trite and barely has anything to do with anything. Doesn't really flesh out the characters, doesn't really flesh out the situation. It's basically just there to be a dilemma and nothing else. Okay. So not what I would call overly interesting, and I frankly have not much to say about it, other than one little point. I know this is jumping forward, but this is the only point about the A-plot that is relevant to me. So first of all, Harry Kim, while they're coming, is like, "Sir, we don't have enough time to shut down the holodeck properly, so we might lose most of Fairhaven." Now, I've heard some non-tech savvy people scoff at that. Granted, Star Trek is supposed to be more advanced than we are, but I want you to try being in the middle of running a program sometime and pulling the plug. Actually, it's worse than that, what they did. Basically, imagine running an electric jolt through your computer when you're in the middle of running a program. There's a pretty decent chance you're going to do permanent damage to the files there. It's not 100% guaranteed, but it's a chance. I myself have actually had an issue. I'm actually very, very pissed off about this, and in fact, may never fully recover from this. But I had an issue where I was syncing my iPhone to my new iPhone to the computer, and something went wrong with one of the syncing processes. I know exactly what happened, and I know when it happened, but because something went wrong with the syncing, some of that music has been damaged. As in, the file was damaged. Doesn't matter what I open the file in, there's a blip now in the actual MP3. Some of that music I had backups of because it's my music. It's one of the most important things to me. So I actually have like 3 backups of that. So I've been very inch by inch replacing those songs with copies that are not broken. But that's still really irritating. And that's just a song. Imagine a holodeck program. So it does make sense that there will be damage to it. That being said, why does he bring this up? If you were... I'm going to try very hard not to quote Sci-Fi Debris on this, because he's already looked at this episode, and damn it, he's already beating me in every other way. I don't want to start aping off of his stuff for his show. Lord knows he works hard enough on his stuff. But I do agree with his general sentiment. If I had to burn some of my precious cannot replace them works in order to survive for some kind of emergency, if it was between the books and living, that's not a choice. I am a huge advocate of life is more important than survival, but I also understand that life cannot exist without survival. Because if you're dead, you can't live. I know this is very complicated stuff. Forgive me for getting into some of the most complicated topics I've ever talked about on my show. But yeah. So the fact that Harry's like, "Sir, we may lose Fairhaven," is just like, why do you even bring that up? Of course, we know why they bring it up. Because the A-plot is actually no threat to the ship. It's a threat to Fairhaven. And the only thing that takes any lasting damage from the A-plot is Fairhaven. However, credit where credit is due. They make a note about how it'll take 6 to 7 weeks to fix the program. Now, I know what you're saying. Why is that credit? Because 6 weeks later, the episode Spirit Folk came out. Nice touch. That's pretty good. For those of you not aware, Spirit Folk is the next Fairhaven episode, and I believe last. So, I wanted to talk about that. The A-plot is stupid. I I have a bunch of notes here. Most of this has to do with the big two things I want to hit. Let me speculate a little bit. I've read a bunch of stuff about Brannon Braga. As I've mentioned, over the course of the last... Gosh, it's been like 2 years since we've been doing this Voyager thing. That's a weird thought, isn't it? For the last 2 years or so, as we've been doing this Voyager stuff, I've been getting more and more respect for Brannon Braga. I know that sounds weird, but you guys know me. I tend to be a don't look at the surface kind of guy. I'm one of those let's dig into the real details, because if you look at the surface, you tend to get impressions which, in my experience, are almost universally wrong. To give you an example, let's say person A, this is a completely made-up example, person A is trying to get a new promotion in the company. Person B accuses person A of stealing from the company, embezzling. Now, person A is not embezzling from the company, and there is obviously no proof of them embezzling from the company because they aren't. But the accusation itself tends to lead itself towards some people are going to look at that person differently. Because most of these people are not actually friends. They are co-workers. They only look at the surface level. So on the surface level, you're seeing this person with suspicion and mistrust, and that person may have just lost his job. Something similar to this actually did happen in the gaming world somewhat recently, for an accusation that was completely false. And proven false. But the damage was already done at that point in time because of that surface level mentality. You see why I'm against that? So, because it can cause very real damage in the real world. So, on the surface level, Brannon Braga is an idiot. All you have to do is look at Threshold to tell that one. But when you dig in there, you see a passionate, creative writer who was very stifled by his environment and his boss, who constantly got the flack for things that he was either forced to do or things he didn't do. A lot of the blame for a lot of the things that Brannon Braga receives actually sits on Rick Berman's or the network executives in general's shoulders, not Brannon Braga himself. Now, that being said, of course, Brannon Braga is not perfect. He has made many mistakes, and I've discussed those on this show, because that's part of looking under the surface, too. You see a more complete picture. So no, he's not innocent. No, he's not completely... like, to use our earlier parallel, this is now reaching fiction at this point. Let's say the guy wasn't embezzling, but he was stealing, like, office supplies on a regular basis. So he's not as horrible as everyone says, but he's also not completely squeaky clean at the same time. Make sense? So I found myself defending Brannon Braga a lot, and I want to speculate on this, because one of the things I've learned about him is that he really tried to push Voyager into being something... And I hate to keep using this quote, but it is such an accurate quote for what I mean. He wanted to add to the substance of the universe. He wanted to do something not just for the money. He had real passion for the work, real passion for creative works and for science fiction in general, and for Star Trek in particular. A lot of his career was focused around Star Trek. I mean, starting with TNG when he was very young, younger than I am, younger than I am now, I mean. He is obviously older than I am. And he really wanted to try new things. And one of the things he was fascinated with was trying basically genre hopping. Now, the holodeck has always been the perfect thing for genre hopping because they like doing period pieces. This would actually be used to bad intent over on Enterprise, but I don't want to get to that right now. So I have a speculation that Fairhaven and its very concepts, I haven't been able to back this up with facts, just other than what I've just told you, is something that Braga pushed because he wanted to try something different. And that also applies to that a day in the life thing. Because this is a little bit of a character piece on Janeway, but only a little bit. There's some characterization for Tom, for Harry, and for the Doctor, and of course for Janeway, who are the major characters here. But really, this isn't a full-on character piece. This isn't the episode where we analyze Janeway as a person. It's a day in the life of Janeway and Harry and Tom and the Doctor, and sort of Chakotay. And I actually like that, like I said. And it does feel like something he would try and he would do. It does feel... It's funny to me, too, because I feel like the only reason the A-plot actually was shoved in was to hit the reset button and get rid of Fairhaven, at least for 6 weeks. That being said, I do want to share one thing. I'm going to be talking about this a great deal more in a minute. Trust me, I haven't even gotten to my big topics. I was just rehearsing this in the shower. I'm not kidding. Because I've got so much to talk about, and I want to say it as clearly and concisely as I can. Yeah, I know, me, concise, right? Because I really want to get this point. This is actually important to me. I have passion for what I'm about to talk about, and I don't want my passion to override my reason and just end up me going, rah, 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 piece of carrots, piece of carrots. So, what I do want to say is that Fairhaven makes perfect sense from an in-universe perspective, right? How many of you out there have ever heard of the game Haven and Hearth? Now, I know probably not many of you. I imagine most of you are gamers, and I'm going to be using games as a relation many, many times over the course of my discussion that I'm about to get into. But I mention that because Haven and Hearth is a game where it takes like 20 minutes to chop a log, few hours to cook a meal, that kind of a thing, right? It's one of those going for authenticity, doesn't hold your hand kind of a games. You know, permadeath, free open world PvP, taking and gathering resources is a very difficult, arduous task, that kind of a thing, right? It has a fairly strong, well, I shouldn't say that, it has a niche following. Because that is an escape for some people. That is fantasy for some people. Some people want convenience in their fantasy. Some people want authenticity. Some people want something that is different from what they have. That's kind of the whole point of the word fantasy, actually. We use fantasy, whether it be in video games, books, movies, television, theater, music, our own imaginations, in order to try and add flavor and enjoyment to our lives. Now, I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as an extreme. That's stupid. Going to an extreme is generally a bad thing, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, too. But my point is, from an in-universe perspective, these people who live on a spaceship, who every day do things that we would love to do, because it's fantasy for us, that's the norm for them. So them going back to a lifestyle of, the Irish town in the middle of, Fairhaven and all that, that being their escape, because it is so different from the norm, that makes perfect sense. But I'm reminded of something that I've been bringing up many times in my show over the last few weeks. The creator versus viewer argument. To explain what I mean, in case you haven't seen, because I've been talking about this all over my show, on my stream and my Ruminations. Sometimes something is interesting to write for. You have an idea, and you can't wait to explore it creatively, as a writer, as a producer of a creative work. And yet, it may or may not be interesting to perceive as a viewer. Because remember, a viewer generally wants to be entertained or intellectually engaged, which may or may not be entertaining, right? What I'm trying to get to here is Fairhaven, I've seen by a lot of Voyager viewers, is generally disdained. It usually sits towards the bottom of the list, along with Spirit Folk, although, in my opinion, Spirit Folk's worse, and this one's much better, but that's just my opinion. But the reason I think for that is because we didn't tune in to watch Fairhaven. We tuned in to watch Star Trek, spaceships, and ray guns, and aliens, because that's our escape. So not everyone is going to be appealed to. It's the same problem the whole Victorian thing had back in the early seasons of Voyager that Jerry Taylor kept pushing and nobody wanted, So, the same argument applies here. The only reason I feel this actually works better than the Victorian stuff was because the Victorian stuff had nothing to do with anything, whereas Fairhaven is a day in the life of the crew of Voyager. It's just the crew having their own fantasies and interacting with each other and trying to get along and blah, blah, blah. And there's some character stuff there, too, just a little bit. Whereas the Victorian stuff had nothing to do with anything. It wasn't an analysis on Janeway. It wasn't some kind of insight into her character. It wasn't revealing for the crew. It was also all solely focused on Janeway, so we only saw her, which was also a limiting factor. So I feel like Fairhaven is a much better way to get across the same idea, even if it's not perfect. But, I wanted to make that point there. A couple other really quick points I just jotted down before we get to the big stuff. First of all, this is great. At one point, the drunk guy, I can't remember his name. I remember the actor, but not the guy. He runs up and says, Oh, you gotta help me. I've broken the fifth commandment again. Now, I was a little curious about this, so I decided to look up, and believe it or not, depending on which version of the text you ascribe to, and there are several, of course, because it's been a few hundred years of translations, the fifth commandment can either mean honor thy father and mother, or don't kill anybody. I'm going to assume they either didn't do the research at all, possible, or they meant the former, because, well, yeah. Also, there's a scene a little bit later, I'll talk, again, not to the real topic yet, where Janeway says she's going to delete the wife. Kate Mulgrew says that with some of the most horrific menace in her tone. Delete the wife. I mean, I could just picture Emperor Palpatine himself. You know, no, delete the husband. I can't even do it. I'm laughing too much. It's just this horrifyingly menacing tone with which she says it. It's great. Of course, Kate Mulgrew plays a great villainess. So there's another thing. I mentioned Chakotay briefly. Chakotay is in this episode. You might not remember that because he has no real point in it other than to comment that it was nice to see Janeway having a little bit of fun. That's pretty much his contribution to the episode. As I've already made clear in the episode Pathfinder, Chakotay basically stopped being a main character in Season 6 and Season 7. And I think that's a damn shame. I like Robert Beltran. And I like the character of Chakotay. And neither of them were allowed to do anything. And I've already made my arguments on this, so I'm not going to rehash that. But just for a little bit of variety, I went to Pax. If you don't know who Pax is, he's one of my best friends. I've known him for like almost 2 decades at this point. And Pax has a tendency towards summarization rather than the more fleshed out thing that I do. And so I'm like, in your particular idiom of, one-sentence descriptions, what would you say about Chakotay? What he said, I had to paraphrase a little bit, because he cusses a lot more than I do. Casual cussing. He wasn't cussing at Chakotay. But to paraphrase, Chakotay didn't do dumb stuff all the time. In other words, he actually liked Chakotay. He felt that Chakotay was one of the only competent officers, because we talked about this after his one sentence. He felt that Chakotay was one of the only competent officers, and one of the only ones that didn't piss him off at one point or another across the show. I could see that. And I tend to agree. And then we discussed why I was bringing it up and blah, blah, blah. So even Pax, who is not a big Star Trek fan, who isn't the kind of person who does in-depth analysis, looked at Chakotay and said, why is he being shunted to the background? And this is just another episode that's indicative of that, and trust me, we'll be seeing more. Blah, 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 blah. I don't want to get too much into this, but there's a scene where we focus on Sullivan. I didn't even write his name down. That's how irrelevant he is. No, none. And he's like, oh, I'm in love with Janeway. Why are we focusing on this? Does it really add anything to anything for the show? I know that sounds weird, but again, that's probably the scene that was most like the Victorian thing. Yes, the Doctor and Tom were there, but they were basically just someone for him to play off of. That scene was pretty much just him bemoaning Janeway, which doesn't mean anything, any more than it meant something back in the Victorian thing, where some character who was designed to fall in love with the character Janeway was playing professes his love for the character Janeway is playing. That doesn't mean anything. It's pointless. This was padding. I've talked a lot in the last few weeks about the difference, especially over on Babylon 5, about the difference between filling and padding. Filling out an episode with character or story-related stuff, and padding. This is pure padding. There's really no point in it, unless you ascribe to a certain mentality, which obviously I don't. And then there's another quote later, which I really, really like. Janeway says, he's just my type. And then she lists exactly what Janeway's type is. This is paraphrased. She likes men who are attractive. She likes men who are intelligent. She likes men who have the same interests. And she likes men who she could change at will. That is so Janeway. I actually burst out laughing. Had to pause the episode, rewind it just to make sure I heard that correctly, and then write down each point just so I could share this with you. That is so Janeway. He's perfect. I can completely control him. I like the showcasing of perception filters. I don't think they're actually brought up in this episode. And it's one of the concepts I've always liked most about the holodeck. Perception filters basically interprets or removes input from holodeck characters so they don't react to it. It's one of the reasons why a character can say computer end program or computer do this or that. And the holodeck characters don't react to them saying that because the perception filters basically remove their ability to recognize that they are saying computer do this or computer do that. This episode actually has the best showcasing of perception filters I've ever seen personally, though. There's a scene where she summons Sullivan. She's in the research R&D lab, just there. And he's in this futuristic sci-fi looking place. She's in her full uniform, hair done differently too. And yet he talks to her as if she had just approached him in the bar. That is perception filters at work. He can recognize her and everything she's saying that relates to him and his character and her character. But he doesn't see anything else there. It is all interpreted into his particular worldview. It's a nice touch, and I like that. Final note. She makes a note, and again, this kind of ties into my final point, so I'm going to use this as a segue. Final point, I should say. She says, I don't want to be able to change him anymore. Now, as I'll make clear in a moment, I don't think that has anything to do with love or romance or anything like that. What I think that has to do with how I played XCOM on the stream. Now, you probably didn't catch that, and unfortunately, I didn't capture all that footage to toss onto my YouTube, my other YouTube channel, the one where I put all my stream stuff, the Zagma Sayal one. So it's in a link down below if you've never seen it. So unfortunately, you probably have not actually seen what I mean by that. So let me elaborate. There's a mode in XCOM where it disallows reloading, basically. So if you make a mistake or something screws up, it's over. Now, I didn't turn that mode on because of bugs, and it turned out to be a good thing. We actually ran into a game-breaking bug, which would have ended the entire playthrough, if not for the fact that I didn't, that I was able to reload an earlier save. So that was a good thing. But I decided to do a personal challenge of not doing reloads, to live with mistakes, unless there was like a UE screw-up or a bug, like I mentioned. Those are the only things I accepted as reloads. So a lot of people died on that playthrough. There was actually XCOM 2, excuse me. A lot of people died on that playthrough, and I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't reload to save them. And that sucked. But that was a choice on my part to enhance my enjoyment of the game. That's what she's doing. She's making a deliberate choice to not reload her save, or in this case, to not change the parameters of the character she is interacting with, to increase her enjoyment with it. It's the exact same concept and the exact same mentality. We choose to play things differently. Why do we speed run? Why do we do speed runs? Because it's fun. There's no forced requirement. There's no ticking clock that if you don't beat a game in 28 minutes, you're screwed. No, we do it because it's enjoyable. Because the extra challenge and the extra focus and the different mindset and really pushing the parameters of what you can do in the game is fun for us. Why do you TAS? Why do you do challenge runs? Why do you, like low-level, no-equipment runs? Why do hardcore runs where if you die, it's over and you start a new character? Why do, all those different things we do in games? That's what she's doing. Because ultimately, the holodeck is a video game. Very advanced, very complicated, but it is. It is a fully interactive medium, and that is what video games are. Which brings me to my big point. I don't actually need my notes for this. At least I hope I don't. This episode has the right message at first and then takes it in all the wrong directions. Let's talk about Mass Effect. How many of you out there cared about characters in Mass Effect? I mean, I'm sure plenty of you did. I did. I cared about my shepherd, Zaydenra. I cared about Talia, and I cared about... Tali, excuse me, not Talia. Talia's in a different show. Cared about Tali, I cared about, Garrus, blah, 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 blah. Rex was my bro. I cared about those characters. They are fictional. They are not real. Okay? You with me? Let me switch gears before I really continue. Based on the fact that you're watching this, I can probably reasonably assume that you... whoever you are watching this right now has had an experience in your life, and please feel free to share if you feel like it. You're not required to. Of a bully, or an idiot, or a bigot, or whatever, who has told you, get a life. Or, it's just a game. How many times have you heard that phrase in your life? I've heard it quite a few. Let's make one thing clear. When someone says, get a life, when someone says, oh, I bet you're a virgin. When someone says, oh, I'm sure, yeah, it's just a game, it doesn't matter. What they are saying, let's make this 100% clear, with total sincerity, no anger, No emotion at all. What they're saying when they say that is, I am not interested in what you are interested in, and therefore what you are interested in does not matter. That is what they're saying. It is also possible, if they don't mean it literally, that they're just provoking you because they're trolls or bullies. That's what those kind of people do. So, one way or another, an invalid statement. The fact that you or I don't like the same things doesn't make what you or I like any less important. That's not how that works. What I like is important to me. What you like isn't important to you, and the two may or may not mix or match. That's just life. That's how we work as human beings. It's one of the reasons I use that term geek as a positive tone. Because geek to me, as I've defined many times, just means that you're an enthusiast, in a positive manner towards whatever it is that interests you. You can be a car geek, you can be a music geek, an art geek, you can be an engineering geek, you could be a programming geek, you could be an internet geek, you can be a video game geek, you can be a television geek. I mean, there's tons and tons of things that are hobbies that we enjoy in life that we can be enthusiasts about. The fact that someone else doesn't like what you like does not make what you like invalid, does it? Yet those comments still tend to sting, don't they? And that has to do with some self-conscious issues that I don't really want to get into right now. But my reason for bringing that up here is because some people seem to think too far in one direction, the one I just mentioned, it doesn't matter, or it's just a game, and some people think too much in the other direction, like the Doctor does. Let me make this clear. Zaydenra Shepard is a fictional character that I wrote, and then affixed to Mass Effect, and then continued writing through the games of Mass Effect. But she is a fictional character. She is not real. However, the emotions, the feelings, the connections, and the memories that were engendered in me as a result of that are very real. And that's the in-between point. That's the balance point right here that so many people seem to miss. So again, all of you out there who liked Mass Effect, did you really feel during the Mass Effect series? Was there anything that you felt, thought, had experiences with, had memories of, still have memories of, I'm sure? Those are real. Those matter. Because they matter to you. Make sense? In other words, the idea that Janeway has a real emotional reaction to a fictional character is not, on the face of it, wrong. Now, I know what you're saying. Well, that's different. I'm not trying to screw Shepard. Or at least I hope you're not. Let me ask you something bluntly. If you were to look at pornographic material and become attached in a way towards one of the models or whatever that you're looking at, of whatever gender it is you prefer, or robots, I'm not here to judge. Squids, that's kind of weird, but still not here to judge. Porcupines, okay, just yeah. If you actually gain some kind of attachment to a particular model, within reason, is there something necessarily wrong with that? Is there something wrong with having fantasy? No, there is not. Now, if you take it to an extreme, I referenced this earlier, yeah, sure, there's plenty wrong with that. And there are, most of the time when you hear about those kind of stories, you are hearing about an extreme because there's no news in some guy happens to have a crush on a fictional character. Some girl happens to have a crush on a fictional character. How many of you out there, be honest, have had a crush on a fictional character? I'll even raise my hand on this because there is one that I've had a crush on. I'll go ahead and tell you who it is. It's Beverly Crusher over on TNG. Gates McFadden is a beautiful woman and a good actress. I'm not ashamed of that. I mean, obviously, I've kind of moved past that. I still think she's attractive to this day. She has aged very well, but that is neither here nor there. I am not ashamed to admit that I had a crush on her. That was a fantasy. So how is that different from what Janeway's doing? You see where I'm going with this? It's difficult to parallel because we don't have holodecks in real life. We can't literally go engage in activities, sexual or otherwise, with our fictional characters. We can't do that. I can't go on the Normandy and go fight the Reapers right now. God, that'd be cool. But I can't do that. So it's hard to parallel things from a holodeck into real life, unless you think about it and dig below the surface, like I just explained to you. There is absolutely nothing wrong with a woman, under her specific circumstances, who is not capable, under her own rule of conduct, by the way. She is the one who determines she cannot fraternize with her crew. Regulations be damned. I think we've made it clear by season 6 that Starfleet regulations are things to be considered guidelines at best. But she has decided of her own free will not to fraternize with her crew, and to be completely honest, I agree with that assessment. It's the same reason you don't get involved romantically with a coworker. There's so many problems with that. I'm not even going to get into it. There's a whole mess of problems with that I really don't want to touch. So, I respect her for that decision, and that makes sense. So she can't be with any of her crew. So that leaves what? A good book? The occasional alien as they go by, like the Doctor himself points out? Or a regular fictional holographic character? Is there anything wrong with Janeway wanting some kind of emotional and physical release on a regular basis? No, there is not. As long as she doesn't take it to that extreme, and nothing I saw in, well, I'll talk about that in a moment. Nothing I saw up to a point indicated that. And you notice I keep saying, is there anything wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with that? Because one of the points of this episode tries to point out that Janeway herself feels ashamed for this. She keeps pointing out he's just a hologram, and oh my god, can you believe how oh god, as if she herself is embarrassed about it. And that's perfectly natural. If let's put you in my shoes for a second. Let's say that you're a little younger, by like 2 decades, and let's say that word gets out that you have a crush on Beverly Crusher in TNG, okay? Wouldn't you be embarrassed to have that news getting out? Of course you would. But does that make it wrong? Does that mean there's something wrong with you? Does it mean you're a freak? No, of course it doesn't. You're a person, and people are just making fun because that's what people do. So her embarrassment is understandable, but it still doesn't make her in the wrong. Now I'm going to pause this topic for just a moment and talk about why the Doctor is wrong. The Doctor starts his argument with the fact that all of the right points, most of the points that I myself have just made to you. He also starts off by saying, the difference here is that you, Janeway, he doesn't say it like this, but he says, his broken heart can be fixed by a switch. I'm more worried about yours. He doesn't say it outright, but the point there being, the importance is on the real person and the real emotions, the real interactions, the real side of the equation that he's concerned by. Then he zips over into Wacko World that he just invented and completely changes his argument by saying instead it's about the fact that, well, it doesn't matter what kind of being he is. And he totally changes his argument. He was up on that tree yelling your name. No, he wasn't. He was going through pre-programmed prerogatives. No, that's no more real than if I were to fantasize about Beverly Crusher, giving me a big hug. I was kind of tame when I was young, so that's about as far as I got. Go ahead and make fun. I'm opening myself up here to help other people to understand this point. I am embarrassed about it, I'm not going to lie. But, if I fantasize about that kind of thing, that's not real. It may engender a real emotion in me, which matters, but she's not there. Sullivan wasn't there. He wasn't up on that tree yelling her name. He doesn't love her. It's not about substance, okay? The Doctor tries to play the race card. And I really hate to talk about this because I try so hard to avoid this in my show, but there's no avoiding it in this case. Because the Doctor will be doing this in the future too. The Doctor plays the race card. He is pro-holographic biased. We've actually already seen this before several times, and we will see this at least 3 more times that I can think of off the top of my head, where he will be more inclined towards a holographic individual because they're holographic. And yet the Doctor himself destroys his own argument. His argument is trying to basically say, if they have, let me use a real-life parallel. If they have a different skin color, are their feelings real? Well, of course they are, because they're a real person. Duh. So you don't want to argue against. That's why the race card works in real life, by the way. You don't want to be the person that, someone says, oh, you're just hating me because I'm insert thing here. Doesn't matter what it is. I'm this. I ascribe to this, and you're just oppressing me because I happen to ascribe to this. Hang on a second. Ants. The bug people will be here tomorrow. You don't want to be the person to say, oh, well, no, you're wrong, because at that point you might be labeled as an anti-whatever category they're ascribing to. So the Doctor keeps pulling this race card, and he'll do it in the future, and he's done it in the past, where he keeps pulling the holographic or real people card. And yet the Doctor himself destroys this argument. There's an episode where he creates a holonovel. It's in the future. About the oppression that his fellow EMH Mark I's are suffering back home, okay? And as he gives that he in that episode, he creates a holonovel, which means holographic characters running through basically a pre-prescribed story, okay? Imagine if you could play through FF6. Can't change FF6, you can just play through it as any of the characters involved. That's kind of how that works. It's a cool concept, actually. So, and there's tons of things I'd love to do a holonovel in. But so he does a holonovel where several holographic characters are tortured and brutalized and killed on a regular basis. The Doctor, who is the biggest pro-hologram person ever, actually, would not do that if those holographic characters were real people, if his whole holograms are people concept was actually 100% true. No, of course that's not true. Only specific holograms under pretty specific circumstances make that final step towards sentience and sapience. I've made the point before that I firmly believe only 3 ever really qualify. Vic Fontaine, Moriarty, and the Doctor. Now, I make that point, but you might say, well, Voyager isn't very consistent. Okay, he destroys his own point in this episode. What's the first thing he says when he approaches her? Sullivan can be fixed with a switch. His parameters can be changed. And he talks several things before he switches to the race card argument about how Sullivan is not real, is not a person, is not an individual, is not sentient, is not sapient, is not real. And then he switches our veins completely and tries to make her think, and tries to shame her, basically, into accepting him. Because, well, just because he's a hologram doesn't mean he's not real. This gets further muddled when she makes the line, maybe I was just worried that he'd love me in return. Now, honesty moment for a second. That's a very human thing to say. It really is. It's also kind of a childish thing to say. I don't mean childlike. I don't mean that as an insult. It's the kind of thing that we tend to grow out of. Because we understand after a while that Beverly Crusher is not real. She does not love me or care about me. She's fictional. She doesn't actually exist. So the idea that Janeway wants to hear that he loves her is frankly pedantic at best. And that brings my whole point full circle here, doesn't it? Yeah, let me check my notes really quick. Make sure I didn't miss anything in this point. Yeah, so, and just to make this point further clear, the idea that she's interested in being loved back is a little ridiculous, because remember how he was at first, and then she goes and changes him. I don't mean she changes him physically. I mean, she changes him a little bit physically, makes him a little taller and changes the beard a little bit, and that's about it. What does she change? She completely rewrites his personality from the ground up. Totally erases his history and basically makes a new person in the same skin. That's not romance and that's not love. That's, well, infatuation at best, but let's call it what it is. That's lust. That's, he's hot, and I want him to have something underneath that hotness. I want some cake underneath my frosting. And again, nothing wrong with that. But that defeats the point of her wanting to be loved, because that's not how that works. The only way this would make sense is if Janeway is a sufficiently emotionally unstable individual that she would actually seek that kind of self-reassurance from an external source. Yes, self-reassurance from an external source. I want to make clear the way I'm saying that. If you've been paying attention throughout this Rumination series, that actually fits with Janeway's character arc a lot, as Kate Mulgrew herself has presented it, regardless of the writers. I've talked about this before, most especially in the episode Night. I talked about the extremes thing. Um, the last point I wanted to make here, real quick. If you had a holodeck in real life, let me rewind a little bit. How many people? So I just want to make one more point clear. How many of you? Uh, I imagine the answer to this is everyone, but I don't want to presume. Want to be with someone romantically? I mean. Now I say this is a weird question because I've reached a point in my real life, and this is getting a little personal, so forgive me, but I'm trying to open up to help you guys understand my point. So, embarrassment here. I've reached a point in my life where I've kind of accepted that I'm going to be alone the rest of my life. In fact, that's kind of what I want. I've been in a lot of relationships in my life, and I don't want to be anymore. But that's me. So I ask you plainly, do you want to be in a relationship? Now, I imagine the answer is probably going to be yes. It is generally considered the norm that most people don't want to live the rest of their lives alone. They want to live the rest of their lives with someone, or someone's, or whatever. Again, there's no judgment. I'm not interested in that here. Okay? So we have a ground state. Most people want to have some kind of romantic and sexual, let's just be honest about it, relationship throughout the remainder of their lives. Okay? I want you to imagine for a moment that you're facing not only the fact that you're alone now, but you're probably going to be alone for the next few decades. How would you react to that? Wouldn't you be tempted, if you had access to something like a holodeck character, to actually try and have some kind of play relationship, some kind of way to release, to have some kind of emotional outlet other than books and your own imagination? And again, nothing wrong with that as long as you don't go to extremes. Wouldn't you be tempted to change the parameters of that character as you go through it? Of course you would. And again, nothing wrong with that any more than changing your imagination on the matter. As long as you avoid those extremes, there's no real problem there. And again, and the point I already made, and I should have probably made this point here rather than earlier, she makes the point where she stops making changes. This is where my video game analogy really comes full circle. Because I played XCOM 2 without reloads as a choice to increase my enjoyment of the game. It is entirely possible, as I played through XCOM 1, to reload all willy-nilly. It's a different kind of enjoyment, but it's still enjoyment for me. So I got to play through XCOM 1 with no deaths. XCOM 2, I had closer to like 24 deaths. And you know what? Each one of those deaths actually hurt. To actually lose those characters, that was a bite. And that sucked. And I tried really hard to undo a lot of that. Or not undo, but to try and make that better. And you know what? In a few cases, I made it worse. But that was still enjoyment of a different matter. Just like her enjoyment would be of a different matter. If she wanted to keep changing him, to keep reloading her save, there's nothing wrong with that. If she wanted to play hardcore mode, or no reloads mode, or a challenge mode, or a speed run, those are self-imposed restrictions on her video game. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think those are my final points here. I hope you guys have enjoyed me ranting for a while. I've been building up to this one for a while, so it's nice to finally get this one off my chest. I don't even know what's next week. I'm taking a bit of a break after this. I gotta go to Gen Con soon, but for you guys, I'll see you next time.